My name's Delano, and I'm going to be talking about systematic white supremacy, the global campaign. So, what is it? We're going to be talking about the establishment of a global system by people called white supremacists that collectively oppresses people who are designated as non-white through violence, both direct and indirect, whilst collectively benefiting people who are designated as white. The motives for something like this are often portrayed as merely for personal individual profit and as being generally normal views for the time. However, many powerful extremists do clearly state their more nuanced white supremacist ideologies, and they were seen as extreme by even their contemporaries. Scholars such as Dr. Francis Cress-Welsing propose that three of the main motivations of these white supremacists are the dominance of resources, genetic survival, and ego boosts. I'm going to draw links between international incidents across generations to indicate the consistency of this ideology no matter where or when it's observed, and how the ideology then translates into policies, laws, and actions which have and still do affect everybody on this planet. We will begin with the offensive campaign of white supremacy. We'll look at some of the exploits and narratives of European imperialism. We'll assess and criticize the collective reverence of some open white supremacist individual figures of history. And we will also acknowledge some of the lesser known genocides committed in the name of white supremacy. We will then look at some examples of resistance against the practices of white supremacy in the form of protests, revolutions, and African independence.
In 1803, the British settled in Tasmania. By 1830, nearly all of Tasmania's indigenous population had been exterminated. This has been termed the Black War. It's still not officially recognized as a genocide, despite the calculated and deliberate virtual extinction of an ethnic group. During this conflict, Governor George Arthur declared martial law, effectively allowing anyone to kill an Aboriginal man, woman, or child. The question arises, why was this genocide allowed, legitimized, and encouraged? And why does it remain unrecognized by both the Australian people and the British people? Most historians agree that the reason is simply because Aboriginal people were assigned a lower race status than the white British invaders. This was only rectified on paper in 1967. Until then, Aboriginal people were legally classed as a lower social-political race group. Massacres were of course commonplace on Australia's mainland. However, due to the lower race status ascribed to Aboriginal people by white European invaders, records were not kept. Despite the lack of official records, historians Raymond Evans and Robert Orser Jensen's research has concluded that at least 65,180 Aboriginal Australians were murdered from the 1820s until the early 1900s in one state, Queensland. Not included in these estimates are the countless eugenics programs and breeding programs constructed by white Australians in the hopes of eliminating the Aboriginal people. One such program has been termed the Stolen Generation, which ran from the 1890s to the 1970s. White Australians wanted to exterminate and get rid of the Aboriginal population under what was termed assimilation policy. They stole children as a government policy, often from birth before the mother had a chance to see them. These were termed blanket babies, as the nurse would hide the child from the mother with a blanket whilst taking it away from her. These children would be placed in homes or fostered to parents, and they were often sexually and physically abused. The children often received little to no education, and were instead trained to be housemaids and stockmen. This is generally still referred to as domestic servitude by the Australian government in retrospect. However, it was essentially a form of child slavery. Some children would be sent to institutions that would be later compared to Holocaust concentration camps. Children would then be, quote-unquote, released at 18 into white society in hopes that they would marry a white person and eventually breed themselves out. Of course, the reality is they were often very scarred from these experiences, both physically and emotionally. Again, due to the lower race classification assigned to Aboriginal people by white Australians, there are no official statistics for the sheer scale and impact of damage caused by this breeding program. Governments often try and understate the figures. However, conservative estimates have placed the numbers at 6,200 children stolen from their parents and families in New South Wales alone.
The most obvious motivational factor for the massacres of the indigenous people of Australia and Tasmania was the dominance of resources, the resource here being land. The eugenics program, The Stolen Generation, is quite clearly about the genetic survival of the race designated as white. So here what we see is an early example of the kind of brutal direct violence that white supremacy encourages on non-white people, as well as a more recent example of the refined form of white supremacy, which seeks to exterminate non-whites through indirect violence. Next, we'll look at one of history's most murderous dictators, a man whose cruel legacy is either ignored or revered in Europe today.
King Leopold II of Belgium oversaw one of history's most atrocious genocidal regimes, resulting in the deaths of around 10 to 15 million African men, women, and children. Yet King Leopold's atrocities remained largely undiscussed and are still not recognized officially as a form of genocide. Leopold declared himself the absolute ruler of a state he plucked out of thin air that he called the Congo Free State, an area 76 times larger than Belgium, which he assumed was his right to claim as a rich white European man. Under the guise of philanthropy, the European dictator stole immeasurable quantities of wealth to increase his personal fortune through the theft of African resources and the enslavement of African peoples. At first, he used the ivory trade, and when rubber started showing bigger profit margins, Leopold began to enslave the indigenous people, enforcing torturous labor conditions on them. Leopold established a private army to maintain his barbaric rule, and when production quotas weren't met, overseers were ordered to cut off the hands, feet, and genitals of men, women, and children. If people resisted enslavement, entire villages would be massacred. There are several reports of women and children being hung in the form of a cross, whilst the men's head would be placed around the village perimeters.
Leopold's brutal regime is clearly an example of dominance of resources through direct violence, and his claims to be a philanthropist show how deceitful European white supremacists will be in order to steal wealth and resources from people designated as non-white. These atrocities have not been recognized as a genocide, even though they fit into the international legal definition of genocide. Further continuity elements can be identified in many ways, most notably the fact that Belgium openly admitted involvement in the murder of the first president of independent Congo, Patrice Lumumba, and only made a symbolic apology in 2002. Next, we're going to talk about a British imperialist whose white supremacist ideals and actions are still celebrated today by extremists and academics alike.
From the 1870s till the start of the 20th century, Cecil Rhodes ruthlessly exploited the emerging diamond trade coming out of southern Africa, at one point dominating around 90% of the global diamond output. Rhodes was an open white supremacist and is partially responsible for the creation of apartheid in southern Africa. One of his primary motivations in business and politics was the ardent belief that whites were a superior race and had a right to dominate and subjugate all other racial groups. Begin quote. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimen of human being. What an alteration there would be in them if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence. If there be a God, I think that what he would like me to do is paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible. End quote. He's also quoted as having wanted to start a secret society in order to extend the influence of the master Anglo-Saxon race over other racial groups. Rhodes established a private army for his British South Africa Company, which directly murdered around 60,000 African people and facilitated the deaths of hundreds of thousands more. When he became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony that made him his fortune, his open white supremacist beliefs led to the implementation of the Master and Servants Acts, which legitimized torturous conditions for African labourers, as well as further segregating and disenfranchising the native population through the Glen Grey Act of 1894 and other acts disguised as beneficial to the native population. Rhodes is often referred to as the architect of apartheid. Altogether, Rhodes stole approximately 1 million miles of African land in what many historians term a racist land grab. These land grabs have continued to create problems for the people of Zimbabwe today. Despite all the evidence of his open white supremacist views and how they've translated into actions and policies that have immeasurably underdeveloped the people of Southern Africa, he is still remembered in positive light by many historians such as Richard McFarlane, who compare him to Abraham Lincoln and deride criticisms as utter vilification, as well as still being championed by his company De Beers Diamonds, who still dominates the trade today. Indeed, the amnesia surrounding the atrocities committed by Rhodes can be easily observed by the fact that a program called the Rhodes Scholarship still exists to send students from ex-British territories to Oxford University. And worse still, a statue commemorating Rhodes is still standing outside Oxford University, despite numerous campaigns by students to have it taken down. The question then arises, why are these open white supremacist mass murderers still celebrated in 21st century Britain?
Again with Rhodes, one can observe the strong element of domination of resources. However, the quotes point to his ego also playing a role in his views and actions regarding the subjugation of non-white people. The images of the Rhodesian flag, the unrecognized state that was named after Rhodes, that's on the jacket of the convicted white supremacist mass murderer Dylann Roof, who killed 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. Next to the flag that represents the apartheid era of South Africa, should really by itself be enough to make people truly assess why a statue of this man remains outside one of the UK's most prestigious institutions. Next, we will look at the ideologies and actions of another British individual who is continuously praised in modern British culture.
Winston Churchill is another open white supremacist who is often touted as Britain's finest hero. As well as having been voted the greatest Briton in 2002, Winston Churchill now occupies a place on the £5 note. He played a key role in the construction of apartheid in South Africa, and was solely responsible for the imprisonment and torture of around 150,000 Kenyans in concentration camps. Despite this, historians such as Richard Toye have argued that whilst Winston Churchill was undeniably a white supremacist, he didn't necessarily advocate the harm of non-whites. His indifference towards the acts of genocide committed against native populations suggest otherwise. In 1937, he made a speech in Palestine saying, open quote, "I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." End quote. This certainly suggests that he had no issue with the harm of non-white peoples, and perhaps even strongly advocated it. In fact, during the Boer Wars, when considering the large numbers of black South Africans dying in concentration camps, Churchill wrote that his only irritation was the fact that Kafirs were allowed to fire on white men. It's essentially impossible to argue that Winston Churchill was not an open white supremacist. John Charmley, the author of Churchill, The End of Glory, states that Churchill saw himself and Britain as being the winners in a social Darwinian hierarchy, where white Protestant Christians were at the top, above white Catholics, whilst Indians were higher than Africans. Now this is important because Churchill is another person, as previously mentioned, who is considered an architect of apartheid. In July 1906, Churchill argued passionately that white South Africans should be allowed to rule themselves and disenfranchise black South Africans. The policies that Churchill put in place to denigrate the black population were so forceful that when 4 years later Churchill's successor tried to undo them, this proved impossible. Some historians argue that the mitigation for Churchill's opinions on race is that they were relatively normal views to have at the time. However, his open white supremacist views and advocacy of chemical warfare and brutality against native people were considered distasteful and extreme even by some of his contemporary peers. So, back to the question as to why then was this man voted the greatest Briton of 2002 by the British public? And more importantly perhaps, why is this the person that was chosen to go on the £5 note in 2016? Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, alleged that Barack Obama had removed a bust of Winston Churchill from the Oval Office. What Bojo forgot to mention is that Barack Obama's grandfather was imprisoned without trial and tortured for over 2 years for resisting against Winston Churchill's oppressive regime in Kenya.
Now let's forget the statues. This man is on the £5 note. Some historians might argue that yes, he was able to lead Britain through World War II. However, as a white supremacist, that is not out of character. Let's not pretend that this was out of a sense of humanitarian aid. Churchill simply wished to preserve the well-being of a race which in his mind had a right to dominate the rest of the world. So essentially means that we are okay with white supremacists as long as they protect us when we need help. Again, the dual fields of domination of resources and boosting his own personal ego are identifiable as strong factors in his white supremacist ideology. Next, we will revisit the theme of genetic survival as we discuss one of history's lesser-known genocides.
Buenos Aires was one of the main points of access in South America during the transatlantic human trafficking triangle. During the 19th century, the population of Buenos Aires was around 30% black, with this figure rising to 50% in more inland regions of Argentina. In 2010, this number had been brought down to 0.37%. How did this happen? Historians often point to the 1865 war against Paraguay and the onset of yellow fever. However, this alone does not explain the disproportionate decrease specifically of Afro-Argentines, however. And historians like George Andrews suggest that there was a deliberate strategy to bring down the black population. In 1868, open white supremacist Domingo Sarmiento became president of Argentina. Although it is true that successive Argentinian governments have for a long time held a desire to be an extension of Europe and have imagined themselves as an all-white nation, Sarmiento was one of the key actors in bringing their white supremacist vision closer to reality. In 1848, Sarmiento wrote in his diary, 4 million are black, and within 20 years it will be 8 million. What is to be done with such blacks, hated by the white race? End quote. In doing this, Sarmiento clearly reveals his anti-black white supremacist values. Many historians believe these translated into his policies, stating that Sarmiento attempted to whiten the population through a policy of covert genocide. Records show that black Argentinian men were disproportionately and likely forcibly recruited into the army, whereupon they would all be placed on the front lines to act as shields for white European soldiers. The result of this was of course a large gender gap in the black population, and due to this, black women began to marry white men in much larger numbers, eventually breeding out the dominance of the African gene as Sarmiento had wished for. Another technique employed was the relocation of Afro-Argentines into neighborhoods without any adequate healthcare facilities during times when diseases plagued the population, in the knowledge that black people would suffer the highest mortality rates. Going into the 20th and 21st centuries, Argentinian history books continue to claim that there are no blacks in Argentina, and that their influence on the country is negligible. Conversely, it is true that Argentina's greatest cultural export, tango, comes from African people, and that the African influence on Argentinian culture is very easily found. The CIA fact book claims that Argentina is today 97% white, making it the quote-unquote whitest country in South America, suggesting that the white supremacist president Sarmiento achieved his goals.
As previously mentioned, the overarching motivational factor here is genetic survival. However, the wish to be an extension of Europe can also be tied into ego boosting. An interesting feature here is that although Sarmiento was a white Hispanic, he was not European, and this indicates that the export of white supremacy from Europe is so effective that non-Europeans will also adopt and implement the ideologies and practices of white supremacy. This demonstrates how the hegemonic nature of white supremacy works, showing that the ideology can and will be reproduced anywhere in the world in varying forms. Next, we'll look at another unrecognized genocide that serves as an example of white supremacist practices occurring without the direct influence of Europeans.
In 1937, Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo gave the order for genocide. The history of this island is one of duality between the African independence of Haiti versus the European colonialist influences in the Dominican Republic. The Parsley Massacre was fueled by Trujillo's wish to cleanse the country of the darker-skinned African presence of Haitians in a bid to bring his republic closer to the European ideal that he wished for. He referred to the killing of Haitians as a form of remedy or as a solution to fix the problems of Dominicans. In October 1937, on Trujillo's orders, the Dominican army hunted down people of African descent living around the Dominican Republic borderlands and asked them to pronounce the Spanish word for parsley to determine whether they should live or die. Haitians spoke with a French Creole accent, and if soldiers heard the Creole pronunciation of the letter R, they murdered the civilian on the spot, whether man, woman, or child. In total, around 20 to 30,000 Haitian civilians were murdered during this calculated extermination, committed in the aim of imitating Europe.
Again, here we have an example of white supremacist ideology leading to a political policy of extermination of non-white people. Whilst there is arguably an element of genetic survival in this act, genetically speaking, Haitian people are very similar to most Dominicans, and this explicit will to be more European points to the act of white supremacy being more about ego boosting. Now, let's look at the ideologies of a man who is generally depicted as being against white supremacy.
Titled by some as the father of India, Mahatma Gandhi is generally remembered as a force which fought against European colonialism. However, when Gandhi lived in South Africa during the 19th century, he made numerous remarks very much in line with the hegemonic nature of white supremacy. Open quote. A general belief seems to prevail in the colony that Indians are little better, if at all, than savages or the natives of Africa. Even the children are taught to believe in that manner, with the result that the Indian is being dragged down to the position of a raw Kafir. Reading through the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, it becomes clear that he was upset that the Indians were treated as badly as the Africans. In this sense, he held a similar view to Churchill regarding the hierarchical nature of race, supporting white supremacy, but disagreeing with Churchill on the Indians' position in this hierarchy. Over 100 years later, in 2016, his statue was removed from a university campus in Ghana in recognition of the remarks Gandhi made about African people. However, in many parts of the world, Gandhi is still celebrated as the pinnacle of morality, and his views on race are not fully acknowledged.
The motivation for these remarks can easily be attributed to a will to boost his ego, and some historians emphasize that Gandhi was younger at this time, around 25, 26 years old. However, the point here is to demonstrate how even an individual who is designated as non-white, who appears to believe in some form of justice, can support the system of white supremacy if it benefits them to do so, which in turn demonstrates how effective this global framework of white supremacy is. Now let's look at some forms of resistance.
Led by Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution started in 1791 and lasted 12 years, banning slavery and ending with the independence of the former French colony. It is the only time in recorded history that enslaved people have liberated themselves and led to the founding of a state. It was fought over a series of successful battles against the French army led by Napoleon, as well as the English, Spanish, and American armies. By 1802, Toussaint had been imprisoned by Napoleon, who had him kidnapped during a period of relative peace after inviting him to France to negotiate, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines had taken over. Once Jean-Jacques Dessalines found out that the French planned to restart slavery, the war recommenced in earnest, resulting in the decimation of all European troops. Haiti was declared independent in 1804, and the remaining French population was massacred by Dessalines, including many women and children. Dessalines declared, open quote, "We have repaid those cannibals, war for war, crime for crime, outrage for outrage," end quote. Some say this was a war on whites, but this isn't strictly true. Jean-Jacques Dessalines explicitly stated it was a fight against France, and unexplicitly, it was a fight against a particular form of white supremacy. Some say that whites were eradicated, but this isn't true either. During the war, many white Poles defected to the Haitian side, and they realized that the French wanted to enforce slavery as they fought on the side of freedom. They were allowed to remain after the war or go back home, as well as the white women who were married to black Haitians, a select number of doctors and medical professionals, and a group of German colonists who'd lived there before the revolution.
Here we see the use of direct violence being applied in reverse to the Europeans who sought to enslave these African people. One should note that Europeans often portray themselves as the victims and the Haitians as the assailants when discussing the history of Haiti. Another important point is that in 1825, France demanded and enforced a 150 million franc debt onto Haiti, claiming loss of property in reference to the Haitians and Haiti itself no longer being legal property of the French white supremacists. This debt was later reduced to 90 million, of which the interest was only finally paid off in 1947. This amounted to around $21 billion in modern terms. This severely underdeveloped Haiti and is still affecting its economy today. This shows how even once white supremacy is eliminated from a country, the global framework can still have an effect. Now let's look at a more local example.
In 1963, Bristol's African Caribbean community, led by Paul Stephenson OBE, gathered their economic power and boycotted the Bristol Omnibus Company for refusing to hire non-white drivers. After 4 months of campaigning, the company was forced to back down and began to hire non-white drivers. Paul Stephenson's campaigns were instrumental in the passing of the 1965 Race Relations Act, the first ever law in Britain to address the realities of hegemonic white supremacy.
Here we can see the framework of open white supremacy being challenged by the mobilization of collective economics, resulting in effective legislation. One should note that although this was an effective form of achieving progress, this alone cannot eliminate white supremacy, as it continues to be practiced in more refined forms. Finally, we'll look at some of the political reform necessary to counteract the effects of white supremacy.
In 1983, 33-year-old Pan-Africanist revolutionary Thomas Sankara liberated the French colony Upper Volta and renamed it Burkina Faso, meaning Land of the Upright People. Sankara was focused on eliminating the French imperial chokehold on the country. He did this by redistributing land from feudal landlords to peasants, embarking on grandiose railway construction projects and championing women's rights, appointing women to high places in government and encouraging them to go to work and go to school even if pregnant. Whilst he was hugely popular both nationally and internationally, particularly across the young and economically deprived demographics, Sankara made enemies amongst those who wished to remain under a colonial capitalist system, and eventually he was murdered in a military coup in 1987. The French government have yet to declassify their files on his death.
As we've discussed, the ideologies and objectives of white supremacy were for the most part quite explicit throughout history, and there's no question that these ideologies form the foundation of much of the conflict and injustices that exist around the world today. Whilst at one point the Race Relations and Civil Rights Acts began to push white supremacist practice to a more refined stage, the Trump era in the West and the rise of neo-Nazi political parties around Europe suggests that the more open form of white supremacy is long from being a thing of the past, both in government policy and wider society. The championing of policies put in place by Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill by mass murderer Dylann Roof also indicates the influence of such ideologies at a more underground extremist level. Of course, countless empirical studies exist which demonstrate the continued effects of white supremacy. For example, how much heavier a sentence individuals designated as non-white receive for committing the same crime as individuals designated as white. As individuals who seek to promote truth and justice, I believe that our role is the creation of a system to counter all the effects of and completely eliminate white supremacy. Thanks for watching.